Hey everyone, welcome to the Piouspodium. It's your host, Nemi Jimenez here. Here at the Piouspodium, we talk everything about apologetics, philosophy, and difficult questions in theology. So welcome to all the people who are listening and all the people that are watching. Today we're going to get into some real philosophical discussion, which is going to be really fun for us today. We're going to start with a good overview and introduction to one of the main disciplines in philosophy, or sub-disciplines of philosophy, known as metaphysics. So let's jump right into that. What is metaphysics? Metaphysics is really the discipline of philosophy that deals with the nature of reality. And inside of this discipline, we ask really foundational things about reality in the world that we live in, the universe. We ask stuff like, why does anything exist at all? And we ask the things that exist, what is the nature of those things? And when I say the word nature, and in philosophical discussion, when we talk about nature, we're really talking about the attributes. We're talking about the identity of things, the qualities. An example of that for humans, part of the nature of humans is if we have free will or don't have free will. That's an example, right? Of the nature of something, its essence, and what it possesses or doesn't possess, right? And in metaphysics, there's a few different sub kind of disciplines in metaphysics that have really technical philosophical words and philosophical terms. And I'd like to lay them out for us because I think it's super important that we kind of have a good understanding of these high technical terms, because in the common day language in the world that we live in, the words aren't used a lot, but they're heavily used sometimes inside of our academic discussions. And it's really important that as young people, we really understand what these words mean so that we aren't confused by high-level jargon or super technical things that sometimes people just use to confuse us, but it's really simple. I'll show you what I mean. The first sub-discipline or sub-studies in metaphysics is something called ontology. And ontology remember, metaphysics is about what exists. And so ontology is asking, what are the things that actually exist, that have what we call being, B-E-I-N-G, things that have being. And that means that they have existence in the world. They exist. And the other second part that ontology is focused on is not just what exists, but what is the quality of their existence? What is the existing that they do, and what does it look like? The second part of metaphysics is what we call identity. And it's basically the question about what makes something the same through time and space and possibly through change. We'll talk about it later in a future episode, but there was a very famous ancient Greek philosopher before the times of Socrates and what we would call the pre-Socratic and pre-Platonic philosophers. And his name was Heraclitus, and he once said that no one can step into the same river twice because that river would be a different river altogether. And the person who steps into the river as time passes would also be a different person. And so I guess you could say that about many things. Like, how do we know when a rock or a statue that is decomposing, how can we be sure that it's the same statue or rock? Like, what allows there to be a persistence of identity in a thing or even in us humans as we change and progress through time? So that's really what identity is about in metaphysics. Things exist, but how do we know that the thing is what it is? It sounds silly, but I promise that it'll make more sense when we get into deeper talks about it, right? And we also ask things like, are there things that are truly identical? When we say that two things are identical, in common language, we're always saying, oh, that's the same as this. And so in this part of metaphysics, we're asking, well, are they actually the same thing? And what does it mean for something to be the same, right? The other part of metaphysics that we talk about is causation and laws. And so in this part of philosophy, we study the difference between a cause and a law. And we try to explain the nature of these causes or laws and these connections, right? We sometimes in our lives see something happen in succession of another event, and we say that because of that, A caused B. And there are many philosophers, one of the most popular ones to do it, to attack causation, was David Hume, who said that there is no actual causation and that it's really something that we make up in our own mind and our perceptions, which is really interesting. But that's a metaphysical conversation. The other part of metaphysics is the reality and the nature of time and space, talking about time and space as either absolute or relative, talking about it as either continuous or discrete, real, not real. There are people who believe that time and space are not actual real. They're just illusory. They're just an illusion for us. And then the final part of time and space in metaphysics talks about if time and space are finite or if they're infinite in their nature. The other part of metaphysics is something called free will, which I think is pretty self-explanatory. A lot of us understand free will, right? It's if us as humans, right, have the autonomy over our choices or not. It's a really simple discussion, but it's been a discussion I think has been going on for many, many, many years. It is one that influences our theology. There are different theological positions, such as Arminianism and Calvinism, when it comes to salvation. And part of that position, theologically speaking, has a philosophical presumption about the nature of humans having free will or not having free will, right? And so what I'm trying to do by saying that is saying that these things are assumed on the most foundational level about the world that we live in. There's two more that I'm going to bring up here, two more subdisciplines of metaphysics. The first is called modality. And this is when we speak about possible worlds or possible truths. This is really interesting. I'll put an example for us. Sometimes when we're talking to people, we'll say, well, imagine if you were in a world where XYZ, you can use it in whatever way you want. In philosophy, we call these things thought experiments. And a lot of thought experiments, what they do, they give us a world that is what we would call contingent, possible. It is something that isn't necessary. But inside of the thought experiment or the proposed modality that we're presenting, the possible world or possible reality, what we're also doing is we're showing what is necessary then in every single possible world or every single possible universe, let's even say, right? So modality talks theoretically, and it's trying to figure out what is contingent, what is something that is just possible, and what is something that is necessary, that must exist in any place, any time, any possible world. And that, again, might sound really, really meta. Metaphysics, I think when I studied metaphysics, it was definitely one of the most challenging studies in philosophy that I had to do, because it really breaks down into some of the presumptions and assumptions that we have about reality, things that we don't think about. And like I said, in a few episodes back, I said sometimes, yeah, philosophy does go round and round in some really, I would say, ridiculous, sometimes a little bit silly, conversations and discussions that possibly, right, the normal person doesn't want to have. But inside of these metaphysical positions, we're going to see in a second how they really have connections to our real world and to some real issues. So before we get to that, let me talk about the last little aspect of metaphysics, the last subdiscipline, which is called cosmogony, which shouldn't be confused with cosmology. Cosmology is the study of the universe, right? The cosmos. But in this same word, cosmo, we have the world and the universe. Cosmogony is about the study of the origin of the universe. So here obviously come in a lot of the discussions about creationism or evolution. These are a lot of those metaphysical positions, right? About what is the origin of the universe. And some of these subdisciplines really make up the metaphysics and modern science that we see today. And really what it is that over time we've taken some of these philosophical disciplines or studies, and we've actually started to apply them to theories that have actually created our modern science. And so why I say that is because maybe later on what we're going to see is how science presupposes some metaphysical positions. And those metaphysical positions, like I said, are going to have a lot of weight and a lot of different implications in other areas of our life. So that's a basic overview of what metaphysics is. Let's talk about an example of one of the most popular metaphysical positions, known as materialism. So materialism basically says that all there is in the universe is matter, motion, and energy. This is the basic, most foundational composition of the universe. And this is obviously one way that we can define materialism. What we're going to find in philosophy is that there are many ways of redefining the same term. A lot of people talk about causation, for example. A lot of people talk about free will or determinism, which is the theory that humans don't have free will. And many people will have a different approach, a different perspective, and sometimes even a different language and definition to these things. And so this is, like I said, in materialism, I'm just giving a basic kind of understanding of it, one that I think is not really concerned with any philosophical position, right? But it's one that I think is just more in common day language we hear, right? Materialism or physicalism, everything that exists is only physical, material, and that's that position that we're talking about. But this position, like I said, is going to have implications into the other subdisciplines. Let's look at what that might mean, right? So if we hold that the world and the universe that we live in is only a material one that is made up of only matter, motion, and energy, then we're saying something, right? What are we saying ontologically? Well, what we're saying ontologically is that what exists foundationally, what makes up everything that is in the universe are atoms or quarks, whatever is the smallest compound of matter, right? With motion and energy. So what does that mean, right? So that means that when we talk about personal identity or the identity of things that have existence, we're saying that they are what they are as long as their material composition is intact, correct? Because if me as a human, if my personal identity comes from what I am made up of, which according to materialism is only going to be matter and atoms and motion and energy being combined and interacted in a particular way. If I'm saying that, we can definitely see how there might be problems that arise when, for example, somebody has a brain transplant or somebody has a heart transplant, right? Because if we've taken it from someone else, what continues to make me me if I have another body part, for example, or if somebody lends me a kidney, am I somebody else now? If we're somebody who holds into a very strong and very rigid belief in materialism, we might run into some problems there because we're saying that personal identity can't be explained by a soul or a mind. We're saying that who we are is only our physical composition, okay? And that's definitely a problem in identity that I want to bring up. But let's go through the rest of these implications of materialism as a metaphysical position. So the third one is like laws and causation, right? If we hold to materialism, then what we're saying is that we are rejecting that they're set up by a creator, for example. That's an alternative. If we believe that God set up natural laws and causation, right? That when water hits the ground, that's when a plant is able to grow. Somebody who holds a different metaphysical position might be able to attribute that to a creator who set those laws in place to govern the world. And I guess in materialism, if we're rejecting a God, which is usually what happens in a materialistic approach to metaphysics, then what we're saying is that laws and causation are just interactions between matter, energy, and motion, which I would honestly say just happen. I don't know what the true explanation for that is. We're just saying they interact, okay? And that's really how law and causation would be affected or implied in a materialistic, metaphysical position. When it comes to time and space, though, we have something interesting where it could go either way. Somebody who's a materialist might say that time is finite or infinite. A materialist might say that for things to have being and existence, they must exist in a time and space plane that is real, right? So maybe in that position, the materialist wouldn't be able to deny that time and space are real, because if those things aren't real, then how can the things that exist in them be real, right? These, again, are really technical conversations. I just want to take us to a real deep understanding of how Christians are supposed to do metaphysics. That's really important for us to understand. How, as Christians, we should have metaphysical positions. And the first thing I want to do before we get there is obviously explain what a common and popular worldly, non-Christian metaphysical position implies and some of the problems that arise from it. Someone that is a materialist when it comes to free will in that subdiscipline might have to reject that free will exists under materialism. Although there are definitely some caveats and they can maybe try and work their way around it. If laws and causation happen naturally and who we are, right, our personal identity is made up only of these physical compositions, and the things that are physical are governed by the laws and causes, right, that happen in nature, then, following that logically, then humans have no power to make decisions in the sense that they are governed by physical laws as well, the same laws that govern the rest of what exists, right? And when it comes to cosmogony, right, the universe started without a God in materialism because all that exists under the matter, motion, energy distinction. And so very popularly, materialism might be in the position of cosmogony in that subdiscipline. They might hold on to the very popular evolutionary theory for how things came to be. So that's materialism. That's a very popular worldview that's proposed by many scientists, by many professors. It's really held by a lot of people in the world. So let's talk about a few of the problems that exist here in materialism. Like I said, this metaphysical position is going to have implications and influences the answers that we get in stuff like ethics or epistemology, which are the two other main disciplines inside of philosophy. And those implications might not be consistent with what we actually want to portray or say. And I think that's really important. And the last problem that we'll talk about first an ethical problem or implication in ethics that might be a problem to that metaphysical position of materialism. We're going to go through an epistemological one, and then we're going to go to the last problem called the problem of unity and diversity, which is one of the great problems that only the Christian approach, I think, has a true answer and explanation for. So stay with me. Let's talk here. What are the problems in materialism? First, let's talk about ethics. If we remember what we were talking about before, if everyone is just made up of stardust, for an example, right? Or we're just matter and motion and energy moving throughout the universe, well, I think that humans lose, or not that I think if you follow logically, right, there is no innate value that is given to humans. It's one that's made by chance. There's nothing forceful. There's nothing of true weight that gives humans any kind of value. If all of us, like I said, are just stardust, one might say that there is little to no justification to being kind to one another. There is no justification, right, for us to have any kind of moral norms, for example, right? Because there is nothing that really sets them. As a matter of fact, if we look and we really hold on to evolution, this is what we might say in that materialistic position. We might say, right, that evolution is just a purposeless process. That's what actual evolutionary philosophers, scientists believe, right? That evolution doesn't have a true purpose. What it might have as a rule of thumb is that the survival of the fittest is what ends up happening. Well, then what is there to say, right? For an example that, evolution made me a ruthless, killer, a vengeful human who likes to be violent towards people. What justification do you have to stop me from acting in such a way if all we are is just stardust? We're just matter. There is nothing of value. There is no human rights, for example. They're just made up concepts that evolution might have produced in other people, but it hasn't produced it in me. And so I think ethics loses its force. Why? Because ethics in its essence, right, is supposed to be about what we should do, what is right or morally obligated of us. But if we are just matter in motion with energy, then at the end of the day, what we should do just becomes whatever we want to do. Because that's basically the only standard that a materialistic approach and position or an evolutionary position of humans can ever really get us. And so there is nothing that could stop me, right? In that context, if I hold on to evolution, nothing can stop what evolution has produced in me. And there is no way to verify that claim whatsoever because, right, it's a purposeless process. Every single person is trying to be the fittest to survive. And in the same way, the evolutionary process of the survival of the fittest some actually presents another problem in this metaphysical position in epistemology, which has to do with the justification of knowledge and the nature of knowledge, right? So what happens in materialism? What happens to our justification for belief and knowing that we can get correct truth and knowledge? What ends up happening? Well, this was made very popular by the Christian philosopher Alvin Plantinga, who says basically this, right? If, according to evolution, we are just trying to survive, our ideas do not have to be correct or right or morally good whatsoever. They don't have to, because evolution says that all our ideas have to be are ideas that are practical, pragmatic enough for us to survive. And if that is the case, right, then there is no justification for us to believe that the ideas that we produce are true at all. This is huge, guys. So basically, evolution undermines our ability to actually have any truth in the ideas that we make up, meaning that materialism as a worldview might as well be a good evolutionary idea. It might be one that helps us survive, but there is no justification epistemologically to actually believe that it is a correct worldview whatsoever. As a matter of fact, more likely than not, evolution will be giving us wrong ideas that just let us exist and let us survive. But evolution, because it is purposeless, will almost never give us ideas that allow us to have any truth involved in the things that we come up with. So like I said, this means that it is likely that the worldviews we produce, such as materialism, aren't correct, but rather just ideas that we use for survival. So those are the two problems in ethics and epistemology that come up from that materialistic metaphysical position. But the last problem, the greatest problem of them all, is known as the problem of unity and diversity, or the problem of the one and the many. And this problem emphasizes that we need an explanation for why the universal and the particular are connected and which came first. Let me explain what I mean by the universal and the particular. There are many human beings, right, that are distinct. They're the particular. They are the diversity. However, there is a unity and there's a universal because although there's a diversity of human beings, there's one human race. The same thing can be said for dogs, for trees, for chairs, for apples. There are different kinds. There's a diversity, but then there's still a unity in their categorization that in philosophy we call a universal. And basically, that materialistic metaphysical position cannot give us an explanation and cannot actually tell us which came first at all. So let me show you how a materialist might want to approach that, right? A materialist might say that particles make up the most basic level of existence and the things that exist, right? But here's the question, right? If, let's say, that basic particle is an electron, our question should be, how are there many different electrons that create the foundation for all things that exist? How is there a diversity of electrons, but they're all electrons? Meaning that there's a unity of electron inside of the diversity of electrons. There is no way to explain that materialistically. Somebody might talk about how, well, the reason why there is this diversity is because they all obey one physical law, right? This law of physics that allows for these electrons to exist in this diversity. But then there comes another question here, right? The question is, how can a diverse number of electrons come from a unified one law? So we see unity, and then we see diversity again presented to us. So if the unified law of physics also depends on numeric expression, I'm getting a little bit deep here. If the physical laws that supposedly explain the diversity in electrons, right? If that needs to be expressed by numbers, there's also a diversity of numbers. And that diversity of numbers would still need to explain unity and diversity. And this time, it's an even deeper kind of diversity. This is the greatest problem that any metaphysical position that is not Christian will face. It's this one. How is it that the diverse worlds, such as the world of numbers, the world of physical laws, and the world of electrons, How do these diverse worlds create a unity and a coherence that we as humans can perceive and understand? That is the greatest problem that any metaphysical approach will have. As much as they might keep trying to push and move farther, at the end of the day, we're going to have to ask ourselves, how is it that the world of numbers, which is diverse and distinct from the world of dogs, how can they coexist and be coherent? There's a unity even in the diverse worlds of things that exist. And I love it. I can't really remember who it was who said, I believe it was R.C. Sproul. He said that a whole bunch of randomness shouldn't give you a unity and a coherence. And that's super huge for us to understand. We can even accept, right? Oh, wow, there's a whole bunch of randomness in the world. But all that randomness shouldn't make one world. It should make a whole bunch of distinct worlds that are not intelligible with one another. However, they are, which means that there needs to be an explanation for the unity and the diversity and that problem in metaphysics. And lots of these problems beset non-Christian metaphysics. And so before we end here, I want to talk about Christian metaphysics, because Christian metaphysics, as I said, is I think the one approach that knows how to actually explain this unity and diversity. And it does so, I think, at the most foundational level. Check this out with me. Christian metaphysics explains the problem of unity and diversity, as well as set a metaphysics with the correct implications for both epistemology and ethics. Where does it do this from? It does so by looking into God's Trinitarian nature, because in God's nature as the Trinity, we have the answer to both unity and diversity. What we see here is that unity and diversity are equal in their ultimacy. One didn't come before the other. They existed at the same time. In John chapter 1, verses 1 to 3, it says the following. It says, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. Through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made that has been made." So God and the Word, the Son, are distinct. However, he was also God, meaning that there was a unity. And as I said, so then the world that God has created reflects the unity and diversity of himself, and it emanates from himself. It's not the same mystery of the Trinity that we're talking about here, but it is God as the archetype, the Trinity as an archetype that is now reflected in all these little areas of human existence and in the world that we live in. And that's super powerful because, as we know, Romans chapter 1 says that his eternal power and nature has been seen and made clear to humans through creation. That's his general revelation. And so God and the Trinity are an archetype, and all that it is created is what we call an ectype. Vern Poythress, in Redeeming Philosophy, says it this way. He says, "The character of God offers the ultimate explanation for the problem of the one and the many. In God himself, the oneness of God is not prior to three persons, nor the three persons prior to the oneness of God." And that explains metaphysics for the Christian. And we can get into more detail, but this is the overview of why the only metaphysical position that is actually coherent and logical is the one where God is in the middle. There is no explaining our universe outside of the Trinitarian nature of God himself. And so us as Christians, we must be ready to defend this position, and we must know how to look at these other non-Christian metaphysical positions and point out that there are problems, huge problems that cannot be ignored and must be answered by the Christian position. And as we move forward, we're going to be talking about how perspectives reflect the diversity in the unity. And this is going to be applied in metaphysics, ethics, and epistemology. All of these philosophical approaches, we're going to see how the Trinitarian nature, the diversity, the perspectives don't take away from the unity, don't take away from the oneness of truth, but enrich it in the same way that God is one and he's three. My name is Nimias Jimenez. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Piouspodium. If you're watching on YouTube, try to like and subscribe. And if you're listening through Apple Podcasts or Spotify, please follow and let the notification ring you every single time we drop an episode, every single Monday. I'm really glad that you're here with us, and I hope to hear you and see you in the next episode. God bless.